this episode of Thoughts and Coffee, we are going to be talking about a graphic novel I just finished last night called Mouse by Art Spiegelman. I was originally going to do another topic for the second episode of this podcast, but this story really compelled me. I was really moved by this story. It's phenomenal. Great piece of work. And I didn't really know this. For those of you who don't know what Mouse is, honestly, a graphic novel feels fairly incorrect because this book is not fiction. It's based on a real story. But the reason people kind of lump it into fiction, I think, is because of because the story is called Mouse. And then to sum it up, it's about a man who wrote about his father's experiences in the Holocaust. And he portrays the Jews as mice and the Germans as cats in the story. And the Polish people are pigs and the French people were frogs. You know, he's got, that adds a very interesting level of kind of definitely the troubling times that the Holocaust brought and basically just fascist Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And it took me about 5 days to read this entirely. I'd say 4 or 5 days. I don't know if that's long or short, but I really was trying not to burn through it because I was just so compelled by the story and so moved by just the elements of it. It's obviously a very dark thing to read. It's very moving and teary-eyed, and you know, there was parts where it was kind of hard for me to push on, actually. But I was so impressed by the storytelling. I was so impressed by the art that Art Spiegelman, the author and illustrator, put into this story, that I had to talk about this in the second episode. Again, I was going to do a different topic, but you know, before I even get into it, as usual, grab your cup of coffee or tea, sit back, relax, and just enjoy this episode and learn something new, something that'll move you, something you're bringing throughout your life into the week, whether it's at work, at home. Learn something important, new. And here's sort of a life lesson here. I have to just give credit first to the author, Art Spiegelman. I mean, his dad, obviously, being the main character of this story, his dad's experiences in the Holocaust and surviving Auschwitz, which he was sent to, and he was there for a few years. This is a strong family, you know. And I have to give credit to the son, Art Spiegelman, the actual author and illustrator of this, because I mean, he goes over his own tragedies sort of in this with his father, and it's just rough. I mean, this is a tough family, and they've really experienced a lot of tragedy. But for Art Spiegelman to kind of push through all that and put this story out is so great and so important to understand what really happened and to kind of know the history of like how people can do this sort of thing. And don't worry, if you know, I'm not trying to depress anyone. This isn't going to be super negative or anything. I'm going to actually just promote this book as much as possible. When I say promote, that's obviously not like sponsored or anything. I just literally loved this story so much that I really wanted to talk about it. And you know what the thing is this isn't new. This book's pretty old. It came out in 2 parts, and I bought a book called The Complete Mouse, which is both parts in one book. And it did very well. It was, I mean, in 1996, it sold about over 500,000 copies in 18 different languages. So it was selling very, very quickly, very fast. And it was used, of course, in a lot of schools and education. It's just this amazing story. It's just incredible to think that someone came up with such a unique idea to tell this story. And in a weird way, this book adds levels of very deep sadness, historical importance, and even in some cases humor. There is actually a lot of humor in this book because this book kind of tells 2 stories, this novel. It's not just the story of the Holocaust and how it's not just the story of the Holocaust, but it's the story of Vladek Spiegelman, who is the main character, the father of Art Spiegelman, who survived the Holocaust. But it's also a story about the relationship between Art Spiegelman and Vladek Spiegelman. And you can tell there's some tension there. And a lot of it's meant to be kind of humorous. Vladek Spiegelman was kind of a character as art portrays him, and that's kind of relatable to a lot of us. So this book does a really good job, I'd say, of making a lot of this stuff relatable, because of course most of us can't relate to the Holocaust or even have a lot of family members that survived it. That's probably a very small branch of us. But the relatability aspect of the tension of family and just kind of the humorous aspect of it is a bit funny, and it's a bit enjoyable to read, and it's just a very smart move, because it reminds us that we're all very relatable despite the circumstances. But the reason I wanted to talk about this so much is it's just been on my mind. This was one of the best, probably most important pieces of writing I've ever read, and it's powerful, it's moving, it's tragic, it's sad, but it really makes you think how far people can go, and how really this wasn't that long ago, unfortunately. Like the 1940s, yeah, it was a long time ago, but if you really think about it, that's pretty recent for something this terrible to happen to the Jewish people, and a lot of other Polish people too, and I mean just endless amounts of tragedy. But this book is so incredible. And it's it's a comic book. I guess that's kind of where the trouble. And I understand Art Spiegelman. I've listened to a lot of interviews with him, and I don't feel good calling it a graphic novel or a comic book. And he's kind of related some of his troubles related to this, because it's not a novel. But graphic novel sounds better than a comic book. When you think comic book, you immediately think superheroes, and which is fine, but this isn't that. And so people go, okay, it's a graphic novel, but it's also not a novel. This is a real story. It is a comic book, though, at the end of the day. Yeah, that's what it is, and it's nonfiction. And I do enjoy the element of, I enjoyed that he actually did go down the route where the mouses and the mice and the cats and frogs and pigs. And I think in a weird way, not only does it paint the actual meaning behind how people really looked at each other, and even in the comic itself, it kind of looks like a lot of the time that they're just wearing masks, and like when you see like the characters shirtless and stuff, they kind of just have normal human bodies, and that says an element of the actual art that Spiegelman put into this. It's just so brilliant and very sad when you think of it in that sense. But I think adding the animal layer to it kind of brings down the tone of the violence just a little. It makes it a little more friendly on the eyes, because if it was depicted like, as real people, I think it would have been really hard to read this novel. And of course, there's pictures that we've all seen in our history books that are just very disturbing. But I think that also adds an element of just, I don't even know what the word is. I guess it's just easier on the eyes when you kind of go over these violent scenes. And I'm not going to spoil anything. Not, even though it's nonfiction, you could still spoil nonfiction. I'm not really spoil anything at all. I highly recommend everyone picks this up and just learn your history and know how far really a political movement can go, especially in our times that are so divisive on both sides of the spectrum. And I'm not going to get into any of that, but I think it is really important to read something like this. And it's a bit heartbreaking. It's, no doubt. It was hard for me to read certain parts. And I won't lie, the one thing that I found difficult to read was actually a lot of the stuff I could relate to was Art Spiegelman's father had 2 heart attacks in his life and survived both of them, and had to go on a strict diet and stuff. And that's how my dad passed away this year, was a heart attack. So even going through those scenes was a little difficult for me. And so when you go through just that, it's tough to read. And then after that, you have to read a bunch of stuff about the Holocaust itself in this book, and it's just like, whoa, okay. And see it through the drawings and illustrations. It's intense. It's an intense read, but no doubt one of the best pieces of writing I've ever read in my life. I 100% a 10 out of 10. This is such an important book. This should be required. My school should have required us to read this, or at least thrown it out there. I think it would have made people a lot more interested in this sort of history and why it's so important to know, and how people can look at each other like that, and how people can follow orders in this sense. It makes you ask so many questions. Again, this podcast, Thoughts and Coffee, it's not really about just me teaching you guys everything, because I have a lot to learn, and I learned a lot from this book. And I don't know if I can properly teach it just finishing it last night, but I'm just saying, read this book, and know your history. This is an incredible piece of work, and Art Spiegelman deserves so much credit and love for this. I heard that I did some research on this, and I heard that in Pasadena, California, someone, I think at some library, California had a lot of libraries and schools. There's been this weird, it's kind of small, but it's growing a little too big for comfort. This movement of like banning books like Fahrenheit 451, To Kill a Mockingbird, which is ridiculous. I mean, banning makes who bans To Kill a Mockingbird, especially with how much it did to shed a light on racism, or even Fahrenheit 451, which is about burning books and basically banning them, and they ban that, which is just foolish and ridiculous and insulting. But this got banned at a library in Pasadena, from what I understand. It could have been more places. I know Russia banned it. That's a whole nother story. But the main reason being they didn't like the depiction of Polish people being pigs in the story, and there's a swastika on the cover. And I find that actually very insulting to even ban a book like this, because this book isn't racist in any sense except depicting what racism can cause. And to ban something like that from, I think it is important for even 8th graders, 9th graders, pretty young people to read something like this and to really understand how far people can go with their political ideologies. And I think banning books, even if it's just one library in Pasadena, and I don't know if that uplifted, this was back in 2012, but I find that very dangerous and insulting personally, and I think that's something to think on. I'm actually considering reading this again. Like, that's how good this story was, and just the art is disturbing yet beautiful, and nothing what it depicts is beautiful, of course, but the art itself is just amazing. It's got a very interesting, it's like a mix of humor and dread. It blends in really oddly. I've never seen something like this, and I'm very new to this graphic. I'm going to call it a graphic novel again for the sake of just making it easier. But I've never seen really been in the graphic novel realm that much. But I've found there's a bunch of graphic novels that talk about deep subjects like this. Like, this is very new to me. And Maus has been around for a really long time. And Spiegelman's done other books. He did a book on 9/11, which I'm really interested in checking out now. And there's another book I want to read about a woman who grew up in Iran called Persepolis, I believe is the name. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I'm just going to be going down this route of reading more of this content, because I've been reading a lot more for the new year, and this was just such an adventure, very intense. But that's really all I have to say. I just kind of want to shed some of my thoughts on this book. I think guys should check it out. I learned so much. This is a very interesting take and way to explain the Holocaust. I've never seen, I don't think anything else out there, whether it's TV, books, documentaries, can do it as good as this did. By the way, I'm drinking decaf coffee, like instant decaf. I know you guys are like just so disappointed in me, but I drink coffee already, and I did plyometrics today. My heart's had enough. And I think reading stuff like this teaches you that any group with any ideology can take things really far, to the point where just an absolute catastrophe and chaos happens. And honestly, that's all I have to say. I want to thank everyone for tuning into Thoughts and Coffee again. I only have these podcasts available on YouTube, so for the time being, so if you can give this a like and subscribe to Cole Parker at YouTube, I would really, really appreciate it. For anyone listening, it's really going to help me out in the long run. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your week. Happy Sunday, and I will see you next week on Thoughts and Coffee.